Mabel Fisher could taste the sea on her tongue before her eyes had even registered the horizon. It wasn't just the familiar, sharp tang of brine and decaying kelp. It was a deeper thrumming, a low, ominous frequency that pulsed beneath the whine of diesel engines and the distant territorial cries of the gulls. Salty Harbor, a tiny, clinging appendage on the rugged coast of Maine, depended on the Atlantic for its survival. Yet the sea had never been a benevolent friend, only a demanding, fickle business partner. On this late September dawn, that partnership felt precariously close to dissolving into raw, unchecked violence. She stood braced on the deck of the sulky Song, her 20-foot lobster boat. The vessel was a patchwork of weather-beaten blue paint and scarred fiberglass, named for the mythical seal women of Celtic lore who were torn between land and water, an echo of the resilient, stubborn heritage that tied her family to this rocky shoreline. The boat was the continuation of her own backbone, the last tangible thing she and her late father had built together, trap by trap, dream by dream. Mabel was 38, with hands as tough as old leather and eyes that had absorbed every shade of the ocean's turbulent gray. She didn't fish for sport or for easy money. She fished because it was the only way she knew how to draw breath. The morning air was unnaturally heavy and still, a suffocating blanket against the usual brisk coastal breeze. The sky above held a sickly bruised green-gray hue, and the horizon line, typically a clean, sharp division between sea and sky, was being rapidly swallowed by a colossal, rapidly swelling tumor of black clouds. The cabin radio, usually a source of mind-numbing chatter about lobster quotas and market prices, now spat out a sharp, insistent static laced with a name that chilled the blood of every soul in the harbor: the red tide, Category 3, with rapid intensification potential. The storm was bearing down, fast and brutal, having deviated from its predicted track in a way that defied the accumulated wisdom of generations of fishermen. "You can't go out there, Mabel," the voice of Jedediah Crowley, the oldest man on the pier, grated through the heavy air. Jedediah, a stubborn pillar of the community in his late 80s, stood leaning on his cane, his face a roadmap of worry that far transcended his usual Christianness. He was Salty Harbor's living archive, a man who spoke in riddles and hard truths. Mabel cinched the last bait bag tight with unnecessary force. "Jed, my buoys are all out there. 30 dozen traps. If the red tide hits and I don't pull them, I lose the season's earnings. You know, we don't have insurance that covers the gear. This boat is my insurance policy." It had been a lean year. Regulations were tighter than ever, and the lobster population seemed to be dwindling under the warming surface waters, a silent, existential tremor signaling that nature was shifting faster than the village could adapt. She needed this final, deep haul to pay the boatyard debt and the new sonar lease. Jedediah shook his head, and in his eyes there was something far deeper than mere disapproval. There was a flicker of ancient primal dread. "The sea is warning us, child. This isn't a seasonal squall. I smell the payment. Remember what my mother taught about the northern waters? When the sky turns that color of sick green, the sea is hungry. Leave the traps. Leave the boat. A vessel can be replaced. A life cannot." The word payment resonated in Mabel's soul like the tolling of a cracked bell. She had always scoffed at Jedediah's folklore tales of siren witches, soul-stealing currents, and the sea's unending demands, but the raw intensity in the old man's gaze felt terrifyingly real. She glanced back at the cabin. On the small navigational table, a faded photograph sat, her and her father, beaming, his white beard flecked with salt spray, on the day they finished the Selkie Song. The promise she had made to him, that she would never let the sea take the boat, was a crushing weight on her chest. It was more than wood and engine. It was the last anchor to the past that mattered. "I'll be back before 10, she promised, her voice tight, turning the ignition key. The roar of the Perkins engine was a guttural challenge against the distant thunder. She cast off the lines, and the Selkie song powered its way into the channel, leaving the quickly emptying port behind. The other fishermen, wiser or perhaps wealthier, had already hauled anchor and headed for the reinforced shelters in the town hall dot as she pulled away. Mabel caught a distorted reflection of the village in the increasingly agitated harbor water. Salty Harbor looked like a fragile diorama beneath the menacing sky-wooden houses huddled together in the narrow inlet, clinging desperately to the continental edge. A sliver of guilt pierced her resolve for her own stubbornness, for valuing a piece of equipment over caution, but necessity was a harder engine than rational fear. The fisherman's life offered no quarter for weakness or superstition. The open ocean devoured her instantly. The change was breathtakingly fast. Within minutes, the choppy harbor waves morphed into emerald mountains that slammed against the hull with the force of a wrecking ball. Visibility plummeted to near zero, and the rain began not in drops, but in slanted, icy sheets that whipped her face like a cat o' nine tails. The radio began to shriek warnings of winds exceeding 70 miles per hour, and the meteorologist's voice sounded like a terrified whimper. Mabel gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, fighting to keep the Selkie song pointed into the swell. She thought of the promise, the traps, the debt, but overwhelmingly she felt the ocean's rage. It wasn't just weather. It felt like a personal vendetta. The sea was testing her worthiness. An instant later, a rogue wave, a towering liquid cliff, larger than anything she had ever encountered, struck the boat broadside. The engine ground, the boat heeled over at a terrifying angle, and the sound of water pouring over the deck was deafening. Fear, cold and utterly visceral, finally eclipsed her stubborn will. Too late, she thought, as she futilely fought to turn the boat back towards the bay, realizing there was no salty harbor left to return to. She was trapped, locked in combat with Euphoria, and she knew the Selkie song was about to sing its final tragic song. The last warning had been ignored. Now, the red tide was coming for its payment. The rogue wave that had slammed the Selkie song broadside was not an isolated event. It was the prelude to the ocean's overture of destruction. Mabel's world dissolved into a chaotic, sickening kaleidoscope of gray water and black sky. The Perkins engine, her faithful workhorse, sputtered and then died with a pitiful, strangled cough, silenced by the saltwater intrusion. The boat, deprived of power, became a cork at the mercy of the elements. She was no longer steering. She was merely holding on, a desperate passenger on her own doomed vessel. The wind was a living, predatory entity. A high-pitched scream that tore at her eardrums and threatened to rip the very clothes from her body. It didn't feel like air movement. It felt like a heavy, horizontal cascade of solid force pressing her down onto the wheel. She had to wedge her body between the helm and the console, using every ounce of her strength just to stay upright. Water poured into the cabin, short-circuiting the few remaining electrics. The GPS screen, her last link to a navigable world, blinked once, a final despairing gasp of white light, and then faded into permanent blackness in the brief. Terrifying lulls between the towering waves, Mabel screamed, a raw, primal sound that was instantly snatched away and consumed by the wind. She wasn't screaming at the sea or at the dead or at her own foolishness. She was screaming a farewell to her father, the memory of his laughter, his hands teaching her the intricate knot of the lobster trap. Flashed behind her eyes a precious, agonizing film reel playing at warp speed. That film reel was about to be burned. A secondary wave, a mountain peak that seemed to scrape the low. Dark clouds hit the Selkie song with an impact that was more explosion than collision. This time, the structural integrity of the old boat yielded. There was a horrifying, splintering crack that reverberated through her bones, a sound she knew instantly the hull had breached. Water didn't just flow in. It surged, a violent, icy torrent that lifted the floorboards and began rapidly filling the cabin. The boat was turning into a tomb, and she was still inside. Mabel didn't pause to mourn the Selkie's song. Survival instinct, honed by a life spent on the merciless ocean, took over. She clawed her way out of the sinking cabin, scrambling onto the tilting deck. The life vest, stashed under the bench, was gone, ripped away by the first wave. She was alone, wearing only a heavy oilskin coat that now felt like a lead shroud dot. She looked desperately toward the mainland, her eyes straining through the stinging rain, searching for the faintest glow of the Salty Harbor lighthouse, a beacon that had guided her family for generations. But there was nothing. The coast, usually a jagged line of defiant granite, was lost in the swirling whiteout. For the first time, a truly paralyzing thought struck her. Salty Harbor might already be gone. This wasn't just a storm sinking her boat. This was an event reshaping the very geography of her life. The boat was submerging fast. Mabel knew the icy waters of the Maine coast would steal her breath and her consciousness within minutes. She had to escape the sucking drag of the sinking vessel. Taking a deep, shuddering gulp of the thick, salt-laden air, she launched herself into the chaos. Pushing away from the wreckage of the Selkie's song, the sea was a maelstrom of conflicting currents. She was tossed, spun, and driven under, the heavy coat dragging her toward the crushing darkness below. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, and the relentless salt water scoured her sinuses. Every time she fought her way to the surface for a desperate, inadequate breath, she was immediately slammed under again. She was no longer Mabel Fisher, fisherman. She was merely a scrap of struggling flesh and bone, trying to resist the elemental force of the red tide. She spent what felt like an eternity suspended in the chaos, battling a profound sense of helplessness. The heavy rain mixed with her tears, creating a strange, warm wash on her face. She closed her eyes and saw her father's smiling face one last time, followed by the dark, churning shape of the Selkie's song as it was finally pulled under by the deeper currents, disappearing into the cold, black abyss. Her anchor to the world, her last promise, was broken. The feeling of absolute, comprehensive loss was so sharp it eclipsed the physical cold thought Mabel gave up the fight. A strange, numbing calm settled over her. The battle had been fought, and the sea had won. She let the current take her, turning her face toward the indifferent, raging sky. Just as the darkness began to creep into the edges of her vision, a solid object, a section of the deck railing, perhaps, or a thick, waterlogged beam slammed into her side. The impact, brutal and painful, served as a shock of pure, unadulterated life, clinging to the floating debris, a meaningless shard of her former life. Mabel fought her way back to a fragile, desperate consciousness. The violence of the storm, ironically, was beginning to abate, signaling that the eye, or the worst of the front, had passed. The waves were still huge, but they were longer, more predictable. She was alone, adrift, surrounded by the remnants of what felt like 100 shipwrecks, bobbing among splinters of wood, shattered lobster traps, and the grim flotsam of a community torn apart. She was alive, but the world she knew was utterly, definitively gone. For the next several hours, she drifted, an indifferent observer of the wreckage. The red tide had devoured everything. She eventually spotted a piece of debris that was larger, more stable, the detached, reinforced storage hatch from her own boat. With a final, agonizing surge of strength, fueled by adrenaline and a deep-seated refusal to surrender, she managed to hoist herself onto the slippery, waterlogged surface. Huddled on that small, makeshift raft, shivering uncontrollably, she looked back toward where Salty Harbor should have been. Only a faint, bruised line of smoke and the occasional, sickly green flicker of lightning marked the location. The sea, having taken its toll, receded, leaving Mabel Fisher marooned on the shattered hatch, the sole spectator to the brutal aftermath of its rage. She had survived the storm, but she had lost the war. Her home was gone, her boat was gone, and the weight of Jedediah's warning, the payment pressed down on her with the crushing depth of the ocean itself. She was adrift in the silence after the thunder, carrying nothing but the profound trauma of total ruin. The silence that followed the storm was heavier, more profound than the loudest roar of the wind had ever been. It was an oppressive, smothering blanket woven from dread and pulverized debris. The air no longer tasted of pure salt spray, but of raw, wet earth, splintered wood, and the unsettling metallic tang of ruined infrastructure. When the first weak rays of morning sun finally managed to pierce the tattered remnants of the cloud cover, they did not bring warmth or hope. They merely illuminated the scale of the annihilation. Mabel clung to the hatch cover, shivering despite the rising sun, the cold having seeped past her skin and settled deep into her marrow. Her mind was a foggy, disconnected mess, replaying the snap of the hull and the final greedy gulp of the Selkie song on an endless loop. She was adrift, but the current had mercifully pushed her toward the familiar, devastated outline of the coast when she finally dragged herself ashore, collapsing onto a chaotic beach, utterly unrecognizable as the neatly manicured coastline she knew. She didn't weep or shout. There was no energy left for that. There was only a hollow, echoing numbness. The sand was strewn with the gruesome artifacts of the red tide, the smashed-up remnants of fishing shacks, overturned lobster boats, not just pieces but mangled, unrecognizable sculptures of fiberglass and rusted metal, and the grim, water-bloated refuse of the sea itself. Salty Harbor was not just damaged. It had been surgically removed from the map, the familiar row of colorful, clapboard houses lining the inlet, the ones Mabel had always thought of as clinging defiantly to the edge of the continent, were gone. Reduced to waterlogged planks, they lay scattered in the mud flats. The main pier, where Jedediah had stood warning her, was a twisted skeleton of snapped pilings. The town hall, the sturdiest brick building, stood listing at a dangerous angle, its roof ripped off like a carelessly opened can. Mabel stood, swaying slightly, feeling like an alien in her own home. The loss was so complete that it defied comprehension. It was a cosmic joke played on a small, hard-working community. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It felt like a betrayal by the very element they revered. The ocean had taken everything they owned, everything they built, and seemingly everyone they knew. She walked inland on numb feet, picking her way through the wreckage. The silence was occasionally punctuated by the chilling, rhythmic drip of water from shattered eaves or the distant, mournful wail of a displaced dog. It was hours before she encountered another living soul. It was Jedediah. He was sitting on a surviving stone seawall, looking out at the ruin of the docks, his cane lying uselessly beside him. He looked ancient, defeated, his face streaked with tears that had carved paths through the grime. "Mabel," he rasped, his voice raw, his eyes wide with relief and shock at seeing her. "I thought the sea claimed you." Mabel sat down beside him, her exhaustion immense. "It's right, Jed. It took the song." The words felt oddly flat, empty of the grief she knew she should be feeling. "The song," Jedediah murmured, his gaze sweeping over the bay. "The sea has a memory, child. It always takes a payment, and that payment is always personal. You should have listened." His words weren't accusatory, merely stating a terrible, ancient fact. "We lost the Peterson family. The lighthouse keeper never made it down. Too many." The news landed heavily, sharp darts in her armor of shock. The human cost. Mabel hadn't just lost a boat. She had lost her community, the familiar faces that defined her life. She tried to picture the lighthouse keeper, a kind, quiet man named Silas, descending the spiral stairs. But the image dissolved into the swirling green-gray water dot in the days that followed. The numbness wore off, replaced by a relentless, grinding grief. Mabel joined the small, stunned group of survivors, perhaps 24, in the agonizing work of recovery. They were aided by the National Guard and sporadic volunteers from inland, but the task was gargantuan. They searched for the missing, cleared debris, and rationed supplies from the one surviving market shed. Mabel worked relentlessly, driven by an almost manic energy that kept her from having to sit still and feel. She avoided the waterline, unable to bear the sight of the churning sea, which now seemed like a predatory beast rather than a source of life. She found herself subconsciously scanning the debris piles, not for salvageable wood or canned goods, but for the distinct blue and white paint of her beloved boat. It was a foolish, desperate hope, she knew, but the final, definitive loss of the Selkie song haunted her more than anything else. Her hope, however, was a luxury the sea had revoked. The last, definitive report came a week after the storm. The Coast Guard had mapped all known wreckage fields and confirmed the total destruction of all vessels in the Salty Harbor fleet. The Selkie song was officially listed as lost, presumed sunk in deep water. That night, Mabel finally broke. Huddled in the temporary shelter, a damp, overcrowded tent that smelled of mildew and despair, she held the faded photo of her father in the boat, and the dam of trauma finally shattered. She didn't cry silent tears. She wept with gut-wrenching, animalistic sobs that shook her entire frame. The sound was the articulation of every loss, her father, her home, her livelihood, and the last shred of the person she had been before the red tide dot in the midst of that total debilitating darkness. The community started to talk about moving on, about relocating inland, abandoning Salty Harbor to the hungry sea. The younger survivors, those without the deep generational ties, began to pack their few remaining possessions. But Mabel couldn't leave. The granite cliffs and the churning, merciless waters were in her blood. She might be ruined, but she was still a fisher of Salty Harbor. She stood watching the bay one more time before the night deepened, her eyes lingering on the spot where the old fishing docks once stood. The moon, now full and indifferent, cast a pale, cold light over the water. Everything was gone, destroyed, lost. It was in that moment of absolute, complete despair that she vowed, if the sea had taken her boat, she would build another. She needed a reason to stay, a fragile thread of purpose to hold on to. Little did she know that thread was about to be cast back to her, not as a piece of wreckage, but as a confounding, silent miracle. 3 weeks had clawed their way past since the red tide had struck. 3 weeks of the agonizing, back-breaking, heart-numbing labor that comes after total catastrophe. Salty Harbor's population had dwindled further. Those who remained moved with a haunted stoicism, their faces etched with chronic exhaustion and the hollow acceptance of permanent change. The air was thick not just with dust and the smell of rot, but with unspoken questions about whether it was worth rebuilding at all. Mabel had fallen into a ritualistic rhythm, wake before dawn, work until total collapse, sleep fitfully, and repeat. Her one deviation was her walk to the rocky peninsula known as the Breaker's Tooth, a headland several miles north of the harbor. She went there not for scenery, but for isolation. She needed a place where the pervasive grief of the community couldn't reach her, a silent granite ledge where she could stare at the cold, unfeeling ocean without having to pretend she was strong. It was on one such gray, wind-whipped afternoon that she saw it at first. She dismissed it as a trick of the light, a deceptive shimmer of driftwood against the choppy, dark gray water. Her mind, she admitted, was not reliable. Grief and sleep deprivation had turned her days into a blur of hallucinations and memory flashes. She rubbed her gritty eyes, blinking against the persistent mist, but the object didn't dissolve. It was a boat, bobbing gently in the remote inlet, sheltered from the main currents by a sharp cluster of submerged boulders, a place where no boat, even a skilled locals, would willingly drop anchor. The shape was familiar, agonizingly so. The distinct curve of the bow, the position of the old rigging post, the exact shade of chipped, faded blue paint she had mixed with her own father 20 years ago. Her heart didn't merely beat. It hammered against her ribs, a violent, sickening drumbeat of disbelief. It was impossible. The Coast Guard had confirmed it. Lost, presumed sunk in deep water. She had seen the wreckage field. She had felt the shuddering snap as the hull breached. Yet there it was, riding the small, protected swells with an unsettling serenity. It was the Selkie song. Mabel scrambled down the treacherous, slippery rocks, ignoring the pain in her joints and the screams of exhaustion from her muscles. She moved with a sudden, desperate energy, her trauma momentarily overridden by a bizarre, fragile hope. When she reached the small, stony beach of the cove, she waded into the icy water, not feeling the cold. Only the mounting surge of adrenaline. She reached the hull, her hand trembling as she touched the familiar, cold fiberglass. It was her boat, but it was impossible. As she pulled herself onto the deck, the impossible became bizarre. The Selkie song was battered, yes, paint was scraped, ropes were frayed, and the electronics panel was obviously shot. But the hull was intact. There was no visible sign of the catastrophic breach she had witnessed. More unsettling, however, was the boat's condition beyond the storm damage. The debris and mess from the red tide were largely absent. The deck had been mysteriously cleared of the waterlogged mess. Almost as if someone had tidied up, she stumbled to the small cabin entrance, her breath catching in her throat, convinced she would find nothing but salt water and a smell of decay. She peered inside. The cabin, while damp, was dry enough to have survived. But it was not empty. Crouched in the corner, amidst a pile of salvaged sailcloth that she did not recognize, sat a figure. It wasn't a fellow fisherman, a survivor clinging to life, or even a victim of the storm's fury. It was a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, dressed in clothes that looked utterly alien, a thick, dark woolen shawl, a heavy canvas skirt, and leather boots that seemed handcrafted for a much earlier century. Her clothing was dry, pristine, and belonged to no one in Salty Harbor, or perhaps even in this decade. She was perfectly still, her long, dark hair falling over a face that was strikingly pale, almost luminous and possessed of an eerie, profound calm. Her eyes, the color of sea glass on a winter beach, were wide open, fixed on the doorway. They held no fear, no surprise, and most unnervingly, no recognition of the tragedy that had just consumed the world around them. Mabel stood frozen, soaked and shivering, the noise of her ragged breathing loud in the sudden, deep silence of the small cabin. "Who are you?" Mabel finally managed to whisper, her voice cracking with exhaustion and shock. "Where did you come from?" "The storm. Did you get in after?" The girl did not flinch, did not speak, and did not move. Her silence was a heavy, impenetrable shroud. She merely reached a hand slowly into the pocket of her shawl and produced an object. She held it out towards Mabel, a silent, profound offering. It was an amulet. Not a modern piece of jewelry, but a heavy, dark wood carving, the color of submerged oak. It was roughly shaped into the stylized form of a wave curling around a fish, but the wood itself felt strangely warm in the cold cabin air. The carving was meticulous, clearly ancient, and unlike any tourist trinket or fishing charm Mabel had ever seen. The wood grain seemed to twist and coil, almost alive. Mabel's pragmatic mind, trained in the unforgiving logic of the sea, fought desperately to rationalize the scene. The Coast Guard was wrong. The boat was dragged by a freak current, The girl was a hitchhiker, a runaway, somehow sheltered by the hull damage, but the sheer impossibility of the intact hull, the girl's anachronistic calm, and the fact that she was the only survivor found on the entire wreck-strewn coastline of Salty Harbor pointed to something far deeper, far more unsettling. Mabel took the amulet, her fingers brushing the girl's cold, smooth skin. As the wood touched her palm, a fleeting, ice-cold chill shot up her arm, followed instantly by a sudden, intense wave of nausea and then a brief, sharp flash of an image she didn't recognize. A massive pre-storm wave, not of gray, but of deep. Bloody red dot. Mabel pulled her hand back, gasping, staring from the unsettling girl to the mysteriously returned boat, and finally to the eerie amulet clutched in her hand. The silence of the girl, the unreality of the moment, shattered the last remnants of Mabel's composure. She had come to the Breaker's Tooth to find solitude in her grief. Instead, she had found a living, breathing mystery seated in the heart of her recovered, impossible past. She knew instinctively that the return of the Selkie song and the presence of the silent passenger was not a miracle. It was the beginning of the real payment Jedediah had warned her about. Mabel's initial terror quickly curdled into a cold, protective instinct. The young woman, the passenger, was silent, utterly unresponsive to questions about her name, her origin, or the storm. She was a ghost anchored to the resurrected hull of the Selkie song. Mabel had to make a choice, leave the unsettling apparition to the mercy of the elements, or face the scrutiny of a devastated community. The instinct to protect the impossible, the miraculous return of her boat, ultimately won. "You're coming with me," Mabel stated, her voice hoarse, pulling the unfamiliar woolen shawl tighter around the girl's slender shoulders. The girl offered no resistance, moving with a fluid, almost weightless grace that further unnerved Mabel. She felt like she was escorting a shadow. Getting the Selkie song back to the main harbor was an agonizing task. Mabel had to use a salvage skiff and a tremendous amount of manual labor to tow the heavier boat, which felt unnervingly light in the water. She kept the girl, whom she silently decided to call Eliza, hidden beneath a tarp until they were close to the makeshift dock. The arrival caused an immediate, stunned silence among the cluster of survivors working near the shore. The sight of the Selkie song, a vessel officially declared lost, pulling into the wreckage-strewn bay was like seeing a dead man walk. Then the collective shock turned to confusion, and then suspicion when Mabel helped Eliza ashore. Jedediah, leaning heavily on his repaired cane, was the first to approach. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, widened with an ancient, deeply rooted fear as he looked at Eliza. He didn't look at the boat. His entire focus was fixed on the girl's luminous paleness and her eyes, those disturbing, sea-glass-colored eyes that seemed to look through the wreckage. Past the present moment, "Mabel Fisher, where did you find this child?" Jedediah's voice was low, laced with foreboding. "On the boat, Jed. She was on the song. She must have survived somehow," Mabel lied, her voice shaky. She couldn't bring herself to describe the girl's pristine clothes or her unnerving calm. The impossibility of the discovery was hers alone. For now, Jedediah ignored her answer. Moving closer to Eliza, he reached out a trembling hand, then quickly pulled it back as if burned. "She is not of the storm, Mabel. She is from the sea. Look at her. Her clothes, her silence. This is a debt collector, child. She's a tide taken." The phrase tide taken spread like a chill through the small crowd. It was an old folk tale whispered in the dark corners of the fish sheds, a legend about those sacrificed to the sea in times of great hunger, spirits who returned to collect what was owed. A tall, formidable woman named Agnes, who had lost her husband and her home, stepped forward, her face hard with grief and suspicion. "We don't need omens, Mabel. We need help." If she survived the red tide without a scratch, where are her answers? Where's her fear? The sea took my Joe. Why did it spare her? Enz's voice was sharp with bitterness, articulating the raw, unjust logic of trauma survivors. Mabel placed herself firmly between Agnes and Eliza. She's shaken. She's a child. She's staying with me until we figure things out. The immediate pressure of the community forced Mabel to examine Eliza more closely. In the relative safety of her own makeshift shelter, salvage shed she was attempting to inhabit, Mabel tried again to communicate. She offered food. Eliza politely refused with a slow shake of her head. She offered warm blankets. Eliza simply held the woolen shawl tighter. Mabel placed the dark wooden amulet on the small, battered table. Did this keep you safe? She asked, her voice soft, exploratory. Eliza's gaze snapped to the amulet. For the first time, a flicker of something, recognition, possessiveness, or perhaps sorrow crossed her pale face. She reached out and traced the carved wave and fish with a delicate finger. It was a gesture of deep intimacy. Why the silence, Eliza? Can you speak? Mabel pressed gently, sitting opposite her. In response, Eliza did something truly profound. She did not speak. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand and, with an impossible surety, traced the exact, intricate pattern of scars on Mabel's left forearm, a collection of small, jagged lines Mabel had acquired over years of handling heavy traps and sharp knives. Then, with a sudden, unnerving precision, Eliza touched a tiny, almost imperceptible burn scar near Mabel's wrist, one Mabel hadn't noticed since childhood. Mabel froze. That scar was not from fishing. It was from a clumsy kitchen accident when she was 6 years old, a secret memory shared only with her deceased mother. No one in Salty Harbor, not even Jedediah, knew that mark existed. How do you know that? Mabel whispered, her blood running cold. Eliza's eyes, those bottomless pools of sea glass, held Mabel's gaze. They weren't just looking at her. They were looking into her, reading her history, her pain, her memories, without the need for words. It was a look that spanned not just space, but time. The chilling realization hit Mabel with the force of the red tide itself. Eliza was not a mere survivor, nor was she mute from shock. She possessed knowledge, impossible knowledge, linked to her arrival and to the return of the Selkies' song. She wasn't carrying a secret. She was a secret, one tied inextricably to Mabel's past and the fate of Salty Harbor. Later that night, as Mabel watched Eliza sleeping a strangely peaceful, statue-like rest, she picked up the wooden amulet. Holding it this time, she felt no pain, only an intense, cold clarity. She understood now. The return of her boat wasn't a miracle of rescue. It was an exchange. The sea had returned her vessel, but only to deliver the price of her own stubborn survival. A silent passenger who carried the weight of the sea's long memory and the secrets of the community's ancient sins. The real storm, the one threatening the fragile peace of the survivors, had just begun. Mabel's initial terror quickly curdled into a cold, protective instinct. The young woman, the passenger, was silent, utterly unresponsive to questions about her name, her origin, or the storm. She was a ghost anchored to the resurrected hull of the Selkies' song. Mabel had to make a choice, leave the unsettling apparition to the mercy of the elements, or face the scrutiny of the devastated community. The instinct to protect the impossible, the miraculous return of her boat, ultimately won. "You're coming with me," Mabel stated, her voice hoarse, pulling the unfamiliar woolen shawl tighter around the girl's slender shoulders. The girl offered no resistance, moving with a fluid, almost weightless grace that further unnerved Mabel. She felt like she was escorting a shadow. Getting the Selkies' song back to the main harbor was an agonizing task. Mabel had to use a salvage skiff and a tremendous amount of manual labor to tow the heavier boat, which felt unnervingly light in the water. She kept the girl, whom she silently decided to call Eliza, hidden beneath a tarp until they were close to the makeshift dock. The arrival caused an immediate, stunned silence among the cluster of survivors working near the shore. The sight of the Selkie Song, a vessel officially declared lost, pulling into the wreckage-strewn bay was like seeing a dead man walk. Then the collective shock turned to confusion and then suspicion when Mabel helped Eliza ashore. Jedediah, leaning heavily on his repaired cane, was the first to approach. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, widened with an ancient, deeply rooted fear as he looked at Eliza. He didn't look at the boat. His entire focus was fixed on the girl's luminous paleness in her eyes, those disturbing, sea glass-colored eyes that seemed to look through the wreckage. Past the present moment. "Mabel Fisher, where did you find this child?" Jedediah's voice was low, laced with foreboding. "On the boat, Jed. She was on the Song. She must have survived somehow." Mabel lied, her voice shaky. She couldn't bring herself to describe the girl's pristine clothes or her unnerving calm. The impossibility of the discovery was hers alone. For now, Jedediah ignored her answer. Moving closer to Eliza, he reached out a trembling hand, then quickly pulled it back as if burned. "She is not of the storm, Mabel. She is from the sea. Look at her. Her clothes, her silence. This is a debt collector, child. She's a tide taken." The phrase "tide taken" spread like a chill through the small crowd. It was an old folk tale whispered in the dark corners of the fish sheds, a legend about those sacrificed to the sea in times of great hunger, spirits who returned to collect what was owed. A tall, formidable woman named Agnes, who had lost her husband and her home, stepped forward, her face hard with grief and suspicion. "We don't need omens, Mabel. We need help. If she survived the red tide without a scratch, where are her answers? Where's her fear? The sea took my Joe. Why did it spare her?" Enns' voice was sharp with bitterness, articulating the raw, unjust logic of trauma survivors. Mabel placed herself firmly between Agnes and Eliza. "She's shaken. She's a child. She's staying with me until we figure things out." The immediate pressure of the community forced Mabel to examine Eliza more closely. In the relative safety of her own makeshift shelter, salvage shed she was attempting to inhabit, Mabel tried again to communicate. She offered food. Eliza politely refused with a slow shake of her head. She offered warm blankets. Eliza simply held the woolen shawl tighter. Mabel placed the dark wooden amulet on the small, battered table. "Did this keep you safe?" she asked, her voice soft, exploratory. Eliza's gaze snapped to the amulet. For the first time, a flicker of something recognition, possessiveness, or perhaps sorrow crossed her pale face. She reached out and traced the carved wave and fish with a delicate finger. It was a gesture of deep intimacy. Why the silence, Eliza? "Can you speak?" Mabel pressed gently, sitting opposite her dot in response. Eliza did something truly profound. She did not speak. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand and, with an impossible surety, traced the exact, intricate pattern of scars on Mabel's left forearm, a collection of small, jagged lines Mabel had acquired over years of handling heavy traps and sharp knives. Then, with a sudden, unnerving precision, Eliza touched a tiny, almost imperceptible burn scar near Mabel's wrist, one Mabel hadn't noticed since childhood. Mabel froze. That scar was not from fishing. It was from a clumsy kitchen accident when she was 6 years old, a secret memory shared only with her deceased mother. No one in Salty Harbor, not even Jedediah, knew that mark existed. How? How do you know that?" Mabel whispered, her blood running cold. Eliza's eyes, those bottomless pools of sea glass, held Mabel's gaze. They weren't just looking at her. They were looking into her, reading her history, her pain, her memories, without the need for words. It was a look that spanned not just space, but time. The chilling realization hit Mabel with the force of the red tide itself. Eliza was not a mere survivor, nor was she mute from shock. She possessed knowledge, impossible knowledge, linked to her arrival and to the return of the Selkie's song. She wasn't carrying a secret. She was a secret, one tied inextricably to Mabel's past and the fate of Salty Harbor. Later that night, as Mabel watched Eliza sleeping a strangely peaceful, statue-like rest, she picked up the wooden amulet. Holding it this time, she felt no pain, only an intense, cold clarity. She understood now the return of her boat wasn't a miracle of rescue. It was an exchange. The sea had returned her vessel, but only to deliver the price of her own stubborn survival. A silent passenger who carried the weight of the sea's long memory and the secrets of the community's ancient sins. The real storm, the one threatening the fragile peace of the survivors, had just begun. The return of the Selkie's song and its enigmatic passenger, Eliza, did more than spark conversation. It ignited a volatile mix of hope and paralyzing dread among the few dozen souls left clinging to Salty Harbor. For 3 days, the sight of the intact blue hull sitting next to the wreckage was a silent, agonizing taunt, a testament to one impossible survival among a sea of undeniable loss. The whispers began immediately. Carried on the damp air and fueled by the raw trauma of the red tide, they were not modern rumors. They were echoes of centuries-old fears, dark tales passed down by the whaling and fishing ancestors who knew the sea demanded reverence and never forgot a slate. Jedediah Crowley became the unwilling voice of this ancient panic. He cornered Mabel by the ration shed, his eyes sunken and troubled. "They're talking, Mabel. They say the song was spared because it was chosen to carry the payment." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that scraped like sand. "The old stories, the ones before the Coast Guard and the radio, they speak of the tide taken, not survivors, but emissaries. People lost in previous great storms, who returned to settle the ledger when the town has grown forgetful." "She is a terrified girl?" "Jed," Mabel insisted, though the memory of Eliza tracing her childhood scar undermined her own certainty. "She's not an emissary. She's a victim." "Victims cry, Mabel. Victims tremble. That girl. She has the calm of deep water." Jedediah pointed a gnarled finger toward a makeshift notice board where the names of the missing, the Petersons, Silas the lighthouse keeper, and Mrs. Joe were scrawled in black marker. "The sea demands balance. The legend says the tide taken bring one of two things, a great gift of bounty and fortune, or a curse that finishes the job the storm started." The fear found its loudest voice in Agnes, who had been consuming her grief with bitter anger. She saw Eliza not as a sign, but as an indictment. To Agnes, the girl's pristine survival was proof of an unfair cosmic transaction. Why Eliza and not Joe? She organized a small, tense meeting in the still-standing shell of the town meeting hall. "Mabel Fisher is harboring a ghost," Agnes declared to the small, weary crowd, her voice amplified by the hollow acoustics of the ruined hall. "We're scraping through rubble, praying for canned beans, and she pulls a girl dressed like a pilgrim off a boat that defied physics. We have to ask, why? What did this girl trade for her survival? For the survival of that boat?" Mabel stood at the back, clutching the wooden amulet, which she'd taken from Eliza for safekeeping. "She is no threat. She hasn't spoken a word. She is in shock. Silence is guilt in the old ways." An elderly fisherman shouted from the corner, his voice trembling with superstitious terror. "Jedediah says she is tide taken. The last time the tide taking came, back in '88, the fishing grounds dried up for 5 years. We rebuilt, yes, but we nearly starved to death first. We can't afford a curse now. We are too weak. The deep-seated belief that nature was governed by a morality, a system of rewards and punishments, was far more potent than any modern skepticism. They feared Eliza because her existence mocked their suffering. She was an anomaly that defied the agonizing logic of their loss. Mabel knew she was losing the argument. The raw grief needed a focus, a palpable threat to rally against. Eliza, silent and strange, was the perfect target. The tension was building to a dangerous flashpoint, a community teetering on the edge of internal fracture. Later that evening, in her shed, Mabel placed the amulet on Eliza's hand. As she did, Eliza's sea-glass eyes finally seemed to focus on Mabel's. With infinite slowness, the girl's dry lips parted. Mabel leaned in, breathless, convinced she was finally about to hear a name. An explanation, a plea for help, instead of words. Eliza's voice was a barely audible, dry whisper, a sound like dry sand shifting in the wind. She spoke a single cryptic phrase, not in English, but in a strange, ancient dialect that sounded like a mix of Gaelic and the harsh, cracking sounds of breaking ice. The lamp is cold. The watcher sleeps. You forgot the promise. The message, delivered with such unnerving solemnity, sent a shiver down Mabel's spine. The lamp is cold. It sounded like a reference to the lighthouse that had guided their fleet for centuries, the same lighthouse whose keeper, Silas, was lost. The watcher sleeps? Was that the sea? Or the guardian of the town? You forgot the promise. Mabel rushed to Jedediah, finding him meticulously sorting salvage nets, his usual task when deep in thought. She relayed Eliza's whispered phrase. Jedediah dropped the net, his hands shaking so violently he had to steady himself against the ruined wall. His face, already pale from strain, went ashen. That dialect, it's the tongue of the founders, of the first settlers who came from the old world. I only heard it in snatches from my grandmother. What does the promise mean, Jed? Mabel demanded. Jedediah slowly pointed his cane toward the sea, toward a spot several miles offshore where the water was known to run strangely shallow. Before the modern lighthouse, there was a cairn of peace, a stone marker built by the first settlers. They made a pact with the sea. If the sea spared their harbor from the great northern storms, they would forever maintain the cairn, keeping a consecrated flame lit in a deep water lamp nearby. A gift to the sea's forgotten guardians, a sacrifice, a tribute, a sign of respect. They maintained it for generations. But when the modern, concrete lighthouse went up 70 years ago, they let the old lamp die. They forgot the promise. They thought progress could buy them out of the old contracts. Jedediah looked at Eliza, who stood silently at the entrance of the shed, bathed in the pale moonlight. The red tide wasn't just weather, Mabel. It was the payment for the forgotten promise. And Eliza is here to remind us, and perhaps to collect the rest of the debt. Mabel looked from the terrified elder to the utterly calm girl, whose strange knowledge and archaic words had just linked the terrifying storm to a long-forgotten ancient covenant. The community didn't just fear a victim. They feared a truth she carried. Mabel knew she couldn't simply send Eliza away. Her own survival and the impossible return of the Selkie song was intrinsically tied to whatever ancient contract Eliza had returned to enforce. The key to rebuilding Salty Harbor lay not in salvaged wood, but in solving the riddle of the tide taken and the forgotten oath to the sea. The fragile trust Mabel had managed to build with Eliza was the last bridge connecting her to the possibility of salvation for Salty Harbor. After the shocking revelation of the forgotten promise, Mabel knew she couldn't rely on the logic of the living. She had to understand the logic of the sea's memory as embodied by the silent girl. The answer, she felt certain, lay within the dark, dense wood of the amulet. She spent the following day alone with Eliza in the quiet solitude of the Selkie song, which had been moored to a temporary anchor, its miraculous return a constant, unsettling presence. The community's sphere made the boat the safest place. Mabel placed the amulet on the small, scratched navigation table, turning the piece over and over, examining the intricate carving of the wave and the fish. The wood was cold, heavy, and strangely immune to the smell of salt and decay that permeated everything else. "Tell me what this means," Mabel pleaded, looking up at Eliza, who sat rigidly on the bunk, her sea-glass eyes fixed on the carving. "Tell me about the promise." Eliza maintained her silence, but the tension in her body eased fractionally. Slowly, she reached out, not to take the amulet, but to place her hand flat on the table beside it. Mabel instinctively mirrored the gesture, placing her own rough, scarred hand next to Eliza's smooth. Pale one. It was then that the true communication began. As their hands lay parallel, Eliza closed her eyes. Mabel, watching, felt a sudden, dizzying wave of coldness wash over her, a deep, pressure-filled chill that felt like plunging into the dark ocean itself. The cabin seemed to distort, the sounds of the distant salvage efforts fading to a muffled drone. A cascade of non-verbal images flooded Mabel's mind, sharper and clearer than any memory. She saw a crude stone structure on a barren, wave-battered spit of land, the cairn of peace Jedediah had mentioned. She saw a group of gaunt, desperate settlers, their faces mirroring the trauma of her own community, hauling a large, ornate copper lamp, lowering it carefully into a deep, rock-protected crevice in the tide pool. She saw them tending to it with fierce devotion, the small, perpetual flame casting a defiant light against the vast, unforgiving darkness of the sea. The images transitioned with brutal speed. She saw the cairn being neglected, the settlers growing prosperous, then complacent. A magnificent, modern stone lighthouse rose on the distant headland, the very one whose keeper, Silas, had been lost in the red tide. In its sleek, concrete shadow, the cairn's ritual flame sputtered, dimmed, and was finally extinguished, replaced by a cold, efficient electric bulb. The promise was broken. The guardian of the old sea was left in darkness. Mabel gasped, pulling her hand away, shaking. The images vanished, leaving her breathless and chilled. "The lighthouse," she whispered, her voice laced with dawning comprehension. "The old flame was the promise. The new one made us forget." Eliza opened her eyes. They held a profound, ancient sorrow. She then pointed, not at the amulet, but through the small cabin window, out towards the turbulent water beyond the bay. She pointed insistently towards the shallow spot. Jedediah had indicated the location of the submerged cairn. Suddenly, Eliza reached for the amulet. She pressed it hard into Mabel's palm and, using her free hand, pointed to the stylized fish carved on the wood. Then, with devastating clarity, she pointed to herself. Mabel stared at the girl, the meaning clicking into place with a horrifying certainty. You're the lamp's keeper? The watcher?" Eliza nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but her answer was undeniable. She wasn't just of the storm. She was tied to the Covenant, perhaps even the spectral continuation of the original Watcher who had tended the sacrificial flame. The red tide had not come to punish the town arbitrarily. It had come because the town had violated an ancient contract of respect, leaving its guardian in darkness. The images returned, unbidden and overwhelming, but this time they were personal. Mabel saw her father years ago mocking the old cairn, using a piece of its weather-beaten stone as ballast for a crab trap. She saw herself as a teenager ignoring Jedediah's warnings about respecting the dead waters around the old site. The town's collective forgetting was built from thousands of small, careless acts of disrespect. And then, the most terrifying vision of all, Eliza was standing on the cairn stone in the middle of a previous, forgotten storm, her dress ripped, her face alight with an agony of purpose, holding a burning torch aloft. As the massive wave crashed over her, the storm immediately subsided. Eliza had sacrificed herself before, trading her life for the safety of Salty Harbor. Her survival on the Selkie Song wasn't an escape. It was a reawakening. Mabel looked at the amulet, now understanding it was a seal, a key, and a record of the sacred exchange. The red tide hadn't destroyed Salty Harbor for its greed, but for its amnesia. The sea was demanding the fulfillment of the forgotten promise, and Eliza was the messenger. Her immediate conflict was no longer about survival, but about belief. To accept Eliza was to accept an ancient, terrifying worldview that held the community accountable for its past. To reject her meant abandoning the only explanation and potentially the only solution for the devastation. Mabel clutched the amulet. The silence that followed was heavy with this impossible shared truth. The girl had unlocked the entire history of the tragedy without uttering a single word of English. The real payment was not the wood or the metal lost to the storm. It was the town's very soul, its capacity to remember and respect the fragile boundary between the land and the vast, powerful sea. The weight of the ancient truth that the red tide was not random fury, but righteous consequence settled on Mabel's shoulders like the crushing pressure of deep water. Eliza, the tide taken and the former watcher of the forgotten flame, was the sea's chilling receipt for the town's amnesia. Mabel, now armed with this impossible knowledge, felt agonizingly isolated from the survivors, who still viewed the girl as either a mute victim or a dangerous omen. Mabel returned to Jedediah, finding him at the remains of his own ruined fishing shack, silently trying to mend a net that was beyond repair, a metaphor for their whole community. She laid the wooden amulet on his lap and recounted the entirety of the vision: the ancient cairn, the perpetual flame, the modern lighthouse, and the ultimate fatal oversight. Jedediah handled the dark wood with an almost religious reverence, his weathered hands trembling. "The cairn of peace," he whispered, his eyes distant. "My grandmother used to pray facing the sea before she spoke the name of Christ. The sea," she said, "hears its own gods." He looked up at Mabel, his gaze clear, devoid of his usual cynicism. So the storm was not just a storm. It was the price for breaking the covenant. It came to reset the balance. "It came because we let the lamp die," Mabel corrected, the guilt sharp in her chest. But why did the Selkie Song return? Why did the sea send her to me? Eliza, who had followed Mabel, stepped into the shack. Her sea-glass eyes met Jedediah's, and for a long, silent moment, the modern fisherman and the ancient oracle communicated without words. Jedediah gasped a low, guttural sound and slowly lowered his gaze, his resilience finally crumbling. "The payment is not finished, Mabel," Jedediah breathed, the effort costing him dearly. The red tide took the infrastructure, the boats, the lives, but it failed to complete its purpose. The sea meant to take the harbor itself, to reclaim the cove and leave nothing but an impassable reef of wreckage. The Selkie Song, it was spared not as a gift, but as an anchor. Your father's promise to never let the boat go was heard, and it was used against the sea's own rage. Mabel recoiled. Her loyalty to the boat, the singular act of love for her father, had ironically become the mechanism for her own torture and the town's lingering purgatory. The sea had respected her bond, but only to enforce a far greater, ancient demand. Eliza then moved to the table and, using a piece of salvaged charcoal, began to draw a crude but recognizable map. She drew the coast, the location of the modern lighthouse, and then, with insistent, heavy strokes, the submerged location of the cairn. Next to the cairn, she drew the image of a massive wave, its crest-tinged red hovering over Salty Harbor. Finally, she drew a single, stylized human figure standing on the cairn, a figure identical to the carving on the amulet, and placed a small, simple fish in its hands. An offering. The meaning was devastatingly clear. The red tide was merely suspended, not vanquished. The harbor remained unsettled and complete. To truly lift the curse and secure the future, the forgotten promise had to be redeemed, the sacred transaction finalized. "She needs the lamp, Relit," Mabel whispered, tracing the map. "We need to get to the cairn and restart the tribute." Jedediah shook his head, his face a mask of sorrow. "No, child. The sea has a different logic now. The tribute failed once. It demands something greater, something symbolic of the debt. The payment, the sacrifice, must come from the source of the resistance, the one who tied the boat down." Eliza gently placed her hand over the drawing of the single human figure on the care, the figure of the former watcher, the symbol of the sacrifice. Then her eyes, filled with deep, terrible knowledge, turned fully upon Mabel with an agonizing slowness. She lifted her hand from the paper and pointed, not at the drawing, but directly at Mabel. A profound, chilling clarity washed over Mabel. The Selkie's song was the bait. Mabel's survival was the price. The sea was demanding a new watcher, a new sacrifice, a soul to anchor the promise and keep the waters calm. Eliza had returned not to light the old lamp, but to deliver the new guardian. "No," Mabel choked out, stumbling back against the wall, her voice trembling with sudden, raw terror. "I can't. I just survived. I just got my life back, even if it's broken." Eliza's expression shifted, showing the first sign of profound emotion Mabel had ever seen, a vast, pitying empathy. She reached out and grasped Mabel's hands. And this time, the rush of images was not ancient, but focused entirely on the immediate future. Mabel saw a vision of Salty Harbor months from now, a vibrant, bustling cove, boats returning, houses rebuilt stronger than before. The fear replaced by resilient peace. But at the edge of the vision, the sea was calm only because a powerful, enduring presence held the massive, red-tinged waves at bay. That presence, that new anchor, was recognizable only as her own spirit. Bound to the deep water near the submerged cairn, Eliza was showing her the cost of true redemption. The red tide would only be defeated, the harbor only truly restored, if Mabel accepted the mantle of the Watcher, sacrificing her life on land for the collective survival of her community. She was being asked to trade her broken, traumatized life for a final, profound purpose to become the Selkie's song made flesh, the permanent anchor between the village and the vengeful sea. Jedediah, having witnessed the silent exchange, simply closed his eyes and whispered, "The sea has found its final payment, Mabel. The debt is high. But the reward is the future of Salty Harbor." Mabel looked down at the ancient amulet clutched in her hand, feeling its cold power, and then at Eliza, who looked suddenly lighter, more ephemeral. The choice was agonizing: cling to her own, ruin life, and let the village wither and vanish, or make the ultimate permanent sacrifice and become the sea's anchor. The storm had been physical. The final battle was purely spiritual. The burden of the revelation was heavier than any wave the red tide had thrown at her. Mabel stood between two agonizing futures, a life of hollow survival, watching her beloved Salty Harbor succumb to the lingering curse and the abandonment of its people, or the ultimate, total self-negation, becoming the sea's anchor, a permanent, silent guardian bound to the cold depths near the submerged cairn. For a full day, Mabel withdrew, seeking refuge not in the community, but in the miraculous, impossible presence of the Selkie's song. She ran her hands over the smooth, inexplicably intact hull, the wood a conduit to her father's memory and her own broken promise. She realized that her loyalty to this boat, this object, had been a distraction, a way to avoid confronting the greater truth of their interdependence with the sea. Her father's final wish had been for the boat to stay, but the sea had twisted that wish, demanding that the soul of the boat, Mabel's own enduring connection to the harbor, become the permanent fixture. Eliza remained a silent, watchful presence, emanating a profound empathy that was almost unbearable. She wasn't pressuring Mabel. She was simply offering the choice. The final chapter of the Covenant. Mabel remembered Jedediah's words. The sea has found its final payment. And Eliza's silent vision, a peaceful, rebuilt salty harbor anchored by her own spirit. The contrast was stark. Mabel's current life was trauma, debt, and gnawing grief. Her potential legacy was the salvation of a community steeped in tradition, giving meaning to her father's loss and her own agonizing survival. She was being offered the chance to trade a life of consequence for a destiny of purpose. The decisive turning point came with the realization that she had already lost the life she was clinging to. The pragmatic, hard-bitten fisherman, Mabel Fisher, had died in the red tide along with her traps and her easy skepticism. The woman who survived, the one who communicated with ancient spirits and held an amulet of dark. Sacrificial wood was already something new. She looked at Eliza, truly saw her not as a messenger, but as a sister in service. You sacrificed yourself for them once, Mabel whispered to the silent girl. You stopped the storm, but they forgot you. Eliza only tilted her head, a hint of ancient weariness in her eyes. The forgetting was painful, but the purpose, the preservation of the community, was paramount. Mabel stood up, her decision hardening into the granite resolve of the main coastline itself. The choice wasn't about dying. It was about anchoring. She would become the permanent essence of the Selkie song, a timeless guardian ensuring the fragile boundary between man and nature remained respected. This was the true Selkie's legacy, not the transformation between a woman and a seal, but the transformation between a survivor and the sea's conscience. Her final duty was to the living. She sought out Jedediah, who was waiting for her with a grave solemnity, as if he knew the answer before she spoke. I will do it, Mabel said, her voice steady and clear, devoid of fear, filled only with resignation and a strange, powerful sense of peace. I will take the anchor's mantle. I will become the new watcher. Jedediah closed his eyes and nodded slowly, tears tracing past through the dirt on his cheeks. Then the debt will finally be paid. You give us life, child. You give us the future we forgot we earned. Her preparations were minimal and profoundly symbolic. She removed her heavy, water-stained oilskins and dressed in a clean, simple woolen shift. She had salvaged clothes that suddenly felt appropriate for her new eternal duty. She returned the amulet to Eliza. This is yours, Mabel said, placing the dark wood in Eliza's hand. Your service is complete. You are free. Eliza looked at the amulet, then at Mabel, and for the first time, a genuine, beautiful smile, transient and shimmering like sun on deep water, touched her lips. She reached out and placed the amulet back in Mabel's hand. Closing Mabel's fingers around it, Eliza then communicated her final message. Not through visions, but by pointing. She pointed at the amulet, then at Mabel's heart, then out to the sea. The sea required the offering, but Mabel would carry the amulet, the covenant, with her into the deep. Eliza's freedom would only be fully realized when Mabel took her place. Mabel stepped onto the deck of the Selkie song for the last time. She ordered Jedediah to take the small, operational skiff and follow her instructions. She would pilot her impossible vessel to the exact coordinates of the submerged cairn. The coordinates she had seen in Eliza's vision. She sat at the helm of the Selkie song, the engine miraculously sputtering to life a final, temporary grace from the sea, and turned the bow toward the open ocean, toward the shallow, deadly reef where the old watchers slept. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors of impossible beauty pinks, oranges, and deep spiritual violets, a contrast to the sickly green-gray of the red tide. Mabel gripped the helm, her eyes clear, gazing at the horizon not as a boundary, but as a destination. She was no longer a fisherman chasing a quota. She was fulfilling a sacred, ancient role. She had lost her father, her home, her livelihood, but she was about to give them the greatest gift of all, the promise of a peaceful tomorrow, bought with the ultimate willing payment. The Selkie song was returning to the sea, not as wreckage, but as a vessel carrying its chosen sacrifice. The final journey of the Selkie song was not marked by storm and fury, but by a profound, terrifying tranquility. Mabel piloted her boat through the fading twilight, the engine a-low, mournful hum carrying her toward the predetermined coordinates of the submerged cairn. Jedediah followed in the small skiff, his eyes never leaving the stern light of the song, the sole witness to the final necessary payment. As they reached the shallows, the engine of the Selkie song stuttered, coughed one last time, and died, signaling the end of its life on the surface world. Mabel did not hesitate. She clutched the dark, ancient amulet, its wood strangely warm, against her palm, and secured it tightly around her neck with a length of rope, a permanent ceremonial bond. Eliza, standing perfectly still on the bow, looked back at Mabel. Her face, usually so pale and luminous, was now starting to fade, becoming translucent, blending with the mist rising from the cold water. She had delivered her message, completed her ancient duty, and her time as a physical anchor was over. The debt was being transferred. Mabel approached the girl. "Go home, Watcher," she said, her voice filled with a final, heartbreaking acceptance. "The promise is being renewed." Eliza smiled one last time, that beautiful, shimmering, ephemeral expression of pure freedom, and then, like a column of smoke disturbed by a breeze, she simply dissipated. She didn't fall or sink. She dissolved into the ocean spray, her essence returning to the deep currents. Finally released from her centuries of reluctant service, Mabel stepped to the rail of the Selkie's song. Below her, through the strangely clear water, she could make out the rough, circular outline of the old cairn of peace. Taking a deep breath, she looked back at Jedediah, offering him a small, brave smile. "Tell them," she called across the water, her voice carrying clearly in the dead calm. "Tell them the sea is patient, but she remembers. Tell them to never forget the promise again." Then, with a resolute grace that defied her trauma and exhaustion, Mabel Fisher, the last of the fishermen, slipped into the dark, icy waters. She did not struggle. She sank slowly, willingly, pulled down by the weight of her choice and the promise of the amulet, disappearing into the depths above the ancient cairn. The sacrifice was complete. Jedediah watched until the last ripple settled. He waited a long time in the skiff, an old man trembling with grief and revelation, before turning back toward the faint, struggling lights of Salty Harbor. The morning. After a palpable sense of peace settled upon Salty Harbor, it wasn't the peace of exhaustion, but the peace of balance restored. The winds were gentle, the sun shone with a clear, honest light, and the remaining water in the harbor was an unnaturally calm, deep sapphire blue. The true sign came from the sea itself. The waves that had relentlessly battered the shores suddenly subsided. The currents became predictable, and, inexplicably, the waters around the reef where the cairn lay became exceptionally clear and calm, even during low tide. The red tide had finally receded, not just the water, but the curse it carried. The remaining community, having heard Jedediah's solemn, unbelievable account of the tide taken and Mabel's final decision, did not scoff or despair. They were too stunned by the profound stillness of the ocean, the sudden, gentle turning of the tide. They accepted the narrative of the sacrifice as the only explanation for their miraculous reprieve. The survivors of Salty Harbor began to rebuild, but this time with a profound solemn difference. They cleared the wreckage, and in the place of the old shattered piers, they built a new massive, reinforced structure they named the Fisher Pier in honor of Mabel. At the very end of this pier, where the eye met the distant spot of the submerged cairn, they erected a small but permanent structure, a stone alcove that housed a simple, ever-burning lantern fueled not by electricity, but by whale oil in the old ways. It was not a lighthouse to guide boats. It was the lamp of the promise, a tribute to the sea and its anchor, a visible, daily reminder that their existence was predicated on respect and memory. The lobster population, which had been dangerously scarce before the storm, returned with startling abundance, a bounty that Jedediah recognized as the great gift of fortune the lore had predicted. Salty Harbor did not forget Mabel Fisher. They never spoke of her as a victim of the storm, but as the keeper of the anchor, the last true Selkie song, a soul who traded a fleeting life for an enduring legacy. Every boat leaving the new pier, every fisherman setting a trap, paused, dipping their hand in the calm water to salute the small, eternal flame and the permanent, silent presence of the watcher who slept beneath the clear, blue waters, ensuring the endless promise held. The new Salty Harbor understood that the sea would always take its payment, but they also learned that the greatest sacrifices are not made in fear, but in acceptance, anchoring not just the boats, but the very soul of the community to a future of profound, resilient peace.